Hello, good afternoon. I know I'm standing between you and lunch, so I'm going to try and make it brief, but I am very happy to follow up with any questions you might have going forward. It's always very interesting to actually think why we care about the electric vehicle story. And I was asked at one conference whether it was important or not. So one of the measures we look at is the share of GDP. And looking historically, we can see around the world that on average, the green line, it sits around 7% of global GDP is derived from the automobile industry as a whole. And you can see that just from the angle of the lines, it's generally growing, and it's growing particularly strongly in China. So we do know that industries, governments, individual companies, financiers do care about this sector. It's significant enough in terms of its scale to warrant close attention. The problem we have is there's an awful lot of uncertainty at the moment, and I'm sure you've covered this morning, but I just wanted to look at 3 or 4 very important different areas where uncertainty comes from, because I know a lot of people tell you that this market is dead certain to grow going forward. And we do have a very bullish growth forecast, but I do want to highlight where the risks come from. So the first risk comes from policy. And the key thing here is the rate at which policy can change, and I'll come to that shortly. The next thing is technology. And while we know that lithium-ion batteries do seem to be the favored choice at the moment, there can be further technologies beyond lithium-ion where different sets of commodities will be required. So not only will the commodities that are being selected today not necessarily be in those cells of the future, but also the timing and the plants built today to make particular batteries may not be valid for a long period into the future. We also have had a big problem with capital availability. I do know that's easing somewhat, and I'm sure conferences like this are full of people interested in deploying capital. But it's actually quite an investment to completely change a value chain that's creating 8-9% of global GDP. It's not a trivial exercise to go into that chain and say we're going to completely rebuild this with a new technology. So we'll look briefly at a couple of examples for capital. And then I want to come back to the final risk I'm going to talk about here, which is production capacity. And it might sound very simple that you build a plant, you turn it on, it works. I think we found from about the last 18 months or so experience that in some of these commodities it doesn't quite work like that. And it's a bit more difficult than people thought to turn on what are effectively chemical plants in an industry where traditionally we were metal producers to make very, very specific chemistries for these batteries to get the performance that people need. So I'll just run through each of those. Last couple of speakers talked a little bit about infrastructure, and I do want to say that infrastructure is a very, very big consumer of energy storage materials. We don't think it's the natural home for a lot of lithium-ion batteries. They're very expensive for their storage capacity, and you're paying for density, which you don't need so much in the stationary storage. There will be room for them in those markets, but enabling infrastructure is not something I'm going to talk about. It is, however, a risk to the market. So moving into detail on policy, there have been an awful lot of policy statements. So particularly in Europe, quite a strong cluster where people are talking about the end of internal combustion engine sales. Not to be confused with the fleets being eliminated. So about 10% of the fleet gets sold each year. So in a 100 million fleet, that's about 10 million cars. So it still takes quite a period beyond whatever this date is for the fleet to be totally changed out. But interesting goals, and in fact the Netherlands have realised since that they can't quite do 2025, so they've released that a little bit. But a lot of this is causing people to make statements of investment in the car chain because of these deadlines that are coming. It's interesting that there's still quite a lot of desire in the US, despite Trump coming into power, and we actually believe that industry as a whole will continue to develop on a similar path as before Trump, because of the social pressure that will come from companies operating in the US. India, very interesting again, that was mentioned with the offtake agreement for Namaska. It's an interesting case where a government who is very reliant on oil imports suddenly makes a policy that would make them very reliant on mineral imports. They don't have any minerals locally. They also have a fairly weak electricity grid in terms of their capability to deliver electric power to the cars. So my colleagues in our office there tell me that it's relatively unlikely that they'll succeed with their goal of 2030, but they have had history, particularly when they banned diesel cars, of implementing policy very, very strongly when they do have a capability of pushing through. So if they stick with the policy, it could be they'll achieve it. We're just not sure about the 2030 date. China's the really big unknown here. So we've had a run of policy that came from carrots for people to invest in the battery supply chain, and now we're moving on to sticks to make sure that every automotive player actually does have a foot in the electric vehicle market. From our point of view, it greatly changed our forecasts for the penetration of battery electric vehicles in the market. And it also sets up companies with partnerships elsewhere in the world. So for any Western company that wants to play in China suddenly has to be able to sell 10 and then 12% of their vehicles as battery electric vehicles. It's going to change the dynamics of the market in terms of who works with whom and how fast some of those investments incur. So when we redid our forecasts at the end of last year, we had quite a significant jump when the policy changed. So this is just to highlight how strongly a policy statement that was this introduction of sticks, you have to sell 10 or 12% battery electric vehicles to be qualified to sell in China, did to our total forecast. Remembering China is by far the biggest market for full battery electric vehicles at the moment, because the government there does not support any of the hybrids that are actually sufficient in Europe to meet a lot of the requirements. So it doubled by 2025, and then it starts to tend back towards trend towards 2030. But a huge impact over about 2 months with a change in policy from China. So by first risk, that's the key one. So technology. I mentioned a little bit about the alternatives. And on this slide here, I run through all the things that we can see in the future. And this really doesn't include all the stuff in universities and in lab scale testing. This is the stuff that's looking a bit more likely. But there is an awful lot of investment going in at the blue sky level to try and get the cost of energy storage down. So in cathodes, we can see that we've got the lithium cobalt chemistry that came through the portable devices. The chemistries that came through in the 2010s, the NMC, NCA, which are the Koreans and the Japanese, LMO, LFP is the one the Chinese adopted, are the mainstay today of the car plants that are being built and the batteries and cells. So LFP is the strong one in China. NCA is licensed from Panasonic to Tesla, so very strong in the US. And the rest of the world pretty much looking at NMC, small amount of LMO. And then moving forward, we're looking at other chemistries where the cobalt decreases, nickel increases. And that's where you see these 811 numbers, 8 nickel, 1 cobalt, 1 manganese, and beyond, because people are already going beyond that in terms of blending the cathodes. And then we start to look at some weird and wonderful. So we're looking at anything that raises the voltage a bit higher. The higher the voltage, the higher the energy density. But in many ways at the moment, the higher the risk in terms of safety, because that hasn't been fully solved. And then in the long term, people looking at batteries that use air on one side. That reduces the cost dramatically, but no one's really got it to work. On the anode side, we've got a lot less variety. We've got graphite, various blends of graphite. We're starting to see spheres of silicon being put in. So the market seems to now be able to cope, or the chemistry copes with the difference in expansion on charging of silicon and carbon. So that seems to be a development that improves the anodes. And in the very long time, it might be that they move towards metal. So at the moment, the graphite market seems fairly secure. Electrolytes, we think, are a particular interest. So at the moment, electrolytes have some lithium in them, in most of these lithium-ion batteries, so it's another source of consumption for lithium. But they're generally hydrocarbons and they burn. So one of the big problems is if you do get a short, these batteries obviously burn very easily, and that's accelerated by the electrolyte. So From our point of view, we think it's going to be critical that people get water-based electrolytes, and we're starting to see some announcements, and then moving into solid electrolytes, both of which increase the safety performance. So we're probably going to see changes in the chemistry there quite rapidly, and particularly as you move towards nickel and get these higher voltages, you need that ever more quickly. In terms of separators, a lot of it's been about keeping the cost down. They're quite technically difficult, even though they're made of plastic, forms of plastic. And now we're beginning to hear about people putting coatings on those separators. And the point of the coatings is to reduce the risk of fire again. And I'm going to come on to the next slide, actually, where we look at high purity alumina. And that's become an interesting market. That can be sprayed on those plastic separators, and it forms a ceramic barrier within the cells, which improves that fire performance. So that was a completely new market for high purity alumina. So just in summary, there's an awful lot of choices. I've just picked out the light vehicles in China here. So we've done this for 8 different regions for trucks, buses, and cars. So every picture looks different. This is Chinese cars, light vehicles. And you can see the LFP, which has been the technology of choice in China to date, the blue on the bottom. Small amount of LMO in short distance cars, and then the ever-increasing amount of various blends of nickel, manganese, cobalt, that Korean technology, coming in as the technology of choice in China. It might be that we're a little underestimating the speed at which 8 nickel, 1 cobalt, 1 manganese can come in. It's proving technically difficult, but with the current very high cobalt price, we're actually seeing moves towards that more quickly than we'd expected in the market. On the other side of the chart, I didn't move on, sorry. So this is the blend of the different technologies, and you can see the blue is the LFP. And on the other side, this is what it means in terms of the growth of these markets. So the chart shows what share of the growth in each of these markets comes from electric vehicles, so the risk associated with the forecast for each of the commodities. So for lithium, an awful lot of our growth forecast is entirely dependent on electric vehicles, and that's because not much is happening in ceramics and Greece. It's a very, very mature market. HPA is my high purity alumina. They're used in LEDs and in electronics, but this is a completely new market, and an awful lot of the growth in high purity alumina will be coming from this market. Cobalt, actually the superalloy market is doing pretty well. So all this story about cobalt being totally driven by electric vehicles, you can see here it's not true. We monitor 36 end uses for cobalt, and all of them are growing. So the growth is shared among multiple commodities, and therefore the risk in our forecast is lower. Class 1 nickel, the nickel market is obviously dominated by stainless steel. And stainless steel's been doing really pretty well, to be honest, compared to recent years with the growth in the Asian market, the costs falling with the new Indonesian assets. So the stainless market is going along strongly. So again, slightly less risk, but because it's class 1 nickel and not nickel as a whole, you do have a higher proportion of that growth coming from the electric vehicles. Graphite, it's used in anodes, electrodes in other industries, but it does measure in terms of the share. And class 1 manganese, it's a very small share of total manganese growth. But a lot of our clients are actually interested in manganese because the purity of manganese you need to go into these cells is also the same purity you need to start making the really fancy steels that go into lightweight vehicles. So when you start making high-strength, low-alloy steels and the trip steels that are going in the future, the final alloying stage there needs that same high-purity manganese unit that you need to be dissolving in acid to make your battery. So both markets are growing in tandem. So as a total of manganese, it's tiny. But in the very specific manganese metal high-purity market, it's really quite a big issue at the moment. So capital, I'm going to whiz through this because I'm sure you all know at least as much about it as I do. One of the interesting things has been the car company announcements. When we first did our chart, and this is not based on anything beyond what car companies have announced and trying to balance it against the capacity we think we need for cars, we didn't come anywhere close in the middle of last year to matching the forecast for electric vehicles against the capacity. By the end of last year, there were enough announcements in the market that we had relative comfort that the market could produce up to about 30 million vehicles per year. Remember, the market's 100 million, and we're going towards 30% by 2030. So it's all within a ballpark reasonable numbers. China is the bottom bar there, very, very important in terms of the units, and particularly at the speed of bringing those units in at the beginning. So a lot of investment coming out of China. And I want to just whiz into lithium. We've been talking quite a lot about lithium in these presentations, and lithium is very interesting because of that change in dynamic from the old ceramics and grease market, fully mature, to the new market. So we get these astronomical growth rates. We've had a huge surge in prices. But over time, we see that the market will return broadly to balance. And the problem we've had in the meantime has not really been the ramping up of the raw material. It's been the ramping up of the capacity in the middle of the chain. So on this slide, we can see a little bit more about the imbalances in the market. On the left, you can see spodumene supply, which is the hard rock mineralogy coming out of Australia. And then the processing capacity, which is the grey line on the top nameplate, and then what we actually think the capacity is installed in the market. And you can see that for the last couple of years, actual usable capacity for processing spodumene has not been sufficient to cope with the mined production. So the market hasn't been being held back by mine production, which what everyone would have thought of originally. It's been held back by the capacity of the supply chain to turn that into product further down. And you can see in the next two charts that a lot of investment is now being made to pull that capacity up around the world. But China do own the vast bulk of that capacity, which you can see in the blue bar. I'm going to whiz on to production capacity, having just started on that. So this is another Chinese story. This is about the batteries themselves. And what we've had in China is a proliferation of companies who can make batteries. My colleagues there tell me there's over 200 at the moment, individual companies that claim to make lithium-ion batteries. And we see a very, very strong consolidation in that market over the next 5 years, driven by the cost pressures that industry will face. So everybody wants to get the cost of unit cells down, cost per kilowatt hour down. So one way of doing that is to play with that chemistry, more nickel, more capacity, no more cost particularly, if you can make them. And the other way is to build your gigafactories. So here we have 5 of the really big players that are currently investing in capacity, and that will create a step change in the cost of those cells as these very, very large plants come into production. We've talked a little bit about this, so I probably won't come back to it too much, but there is a timeline for building these plants. So I showed the length of time that people are announcing for car plants. This is timeline for battery. The last chart was timeline for batteries, 2 or 3 or 4 years to start to build them before they ramp them up. But we do have a difference in the timing along the chain. And this is where it becomes quite difficult to forecast market balance. So in terms of building a mine, the actual mine is relatively quick. Once you've got all the permitting in place, once you've got the feasibility in place, all the pre-work in place, it's not that difficult to actually build the mine itself. In terms of a conversion facility, the same, but the time to actually get it certified to make a material that's good enough to go into a precursor plant, to go into an automotive, can add 6 months, can add a year or more to that time. The precursors then have to qualify their material with the battery maker. So even once they've built their plant, turned it on, you've got another big delay as that material is certified through to battery grade. And then the battery maker certifies the cells with the cars who decide to build it into a future model. So we can't add up the build times. This is my cautionary point here. It just doesn't work. And then we will see imbalance through the chain. Final thing I was asked to talk about was the role of China. So I've just got a couple of slides. So here we have the major players in each part of that chain. So the miners on the left-hand side through to the cell makers. And you can see the change in terms of the concentration globally, moving from mining pretty much all around the world to a cell manufacturing that's very largely dominated by Japanese, Korean, and Chinese. A couple of interesting examples. Spherical graphite, 100% Chinese. Cathode precursors, 75% Chinese. Cobalt chemicals, if you allow for ownership, about 95% Chinese. And if we look forward for the cobalt cost curve, this is a cost curve we've done for the cobalt industry looking forward to 2022. The red bars are the Chinese-owned assets going forward. So again, control from the Chinese of the very high-grade assets. They've done a really good job in identifying those. So just to complete my story, I talked a little bit about policy. You can see that that can change by 50%, the forecast people make in this market. Changes by technology can completely change the commodities, and you can see the speed of the reaction of the industry to cobalt prices in terms of changing those chemistries and other alternatives going forward. The risk of deployment of capital, if you don't know what the technology is going to be, on top of where's the money actually going to come from these days, and then once you've built it, how quickly will it be good enough to make money? And that was what I wanted to talk about. Thank you very much.
Fantastic. I know I'm conscious we've got lunch coming up, but are there any questions for Rebecca? Because that was a really good presentation there, covering quite a lot of ground in a short space of time.
Everything.
Yeah, we've got one here. David.
Just on the policy side, I mean,
yeah.
a few years ago, my impression was that in Europe, the pressure to decarbonise the automotive industry was coming from centrally EU specified engine emissions and stuff. But you now got individual countries coming up with sort of hand-waving decisions. Well, no diesel cars, no ICE. How much of those policy statements actually just reflect a political reaction to the popular image of diesel or ICEs, and how much has actually been thought out by technical advice to the governments?
Okay. I'm not sure on how much technical advice they received, and I think they just chose a date that's long enough in the future that they won't be in power anymore, if I'm going to be cynical. However, I do think the technology does now facilitate people making that kind of statement. So if we'd looked at it 5 or 10 years ago, the cost of an individual cell was so very high, and the capability and the concentration of the people who could make the cells, let's call that the big barrier, was so concentrated in Asia that there was no possibility, no matter how high the social pressure of a government, being able to make a policy statement like that. So now with the curve of reduction of cost of the cells and the advances in technology, it is actually conceivable that economically these battery electric vehicles will be competitive and will be the vehicle that an individual will choose in the market. And I think it does give people the option, particularly with areas like car sharing. If you look at the total cost of ownership, which is how we look at choices people will make about vehicles, because you've got to look at what an individual will buy. There's a few things that are changing. One is who actually owns the vehicles. So historically, we owned our own cars, but going forward, we're probably going to lease them. And the reason that's important is that I'm irrational how I buy a car. I buy the car my dad and my granddad had, or the car I had before, but I'm unlikely to buy the cheapest car. Whereas if I go to an institution, I'm going to be faced with financing costs that reflect the true cost of those vehicles. So I think going forward, for people who lease their cars, they're going to get a much clearer picture of the total cost of those vehicles. The other is where vehicles are shared, so the Uber factor, or any other way taxis and vehicles are shared. With extended life, electric cars become cheaper because there's much less in the maintenance cost. A lot of the cost is up front, and the longer and the more you use that car, the more and more economic it becomes. So again, the technology that allows sharing, again, facilitates the reduction in cost of the cars. So I think that the governments might be making statements early, but I do think that it is within the realms of possibility, if we can find the raw materials and the capital, that many of the goals can be achieved. India, I'm slightly more conservative about in terms of timing.
Rebecca, your forecast of 20 million vehicles capacity by 2025, does that include hybrid?
So the battery plant numbers are just what people have announced, so that includes pretty much everything.
The vehicle forecast.
For my forecast of battery electric vehicles, it didn't. It was just battery electric. But I do have all the others if you're
I
interested.
just wondered what it was, yeah. And when you say class 1 nickel, a lot of the...
Iron-free.
But a lot of the battery makers are using mixed nickel cobalt hydroxide, so they actually make class 1. So
so we're defining anything that doesn't have iron units associated with it as class 1.
Okay.
Because that's the big problem, isn't it? That the nickel price at the moment is predicated on investment in nickel pig iron plants. So the nickel price, you could argue, is not sufficient to incentivise investment in anyone who has to further process the material. So from our point of view, we see the nickel price going up because in order to finance, well, either the nickel price goes up or the premium stays high for nickel sulfate, one or the other, in order to finance people to do that. You can't finance off LME nickel price at the moment to make battery-grade nickel sulfate.
Okay, any further questions for Rebecca? One more.
Just on the technology side, you mentioned fuel cells for heavy goods vehicles.
Briefly.
Are fuel cells likely to affect the rest of the market in terms of passenger cars, etc.?
People have different opinions. So when we've looked at the total cost of ownership of a fuel cell vehicle, they're about twice the cost at the moment. Based on a very small data sample, to be honest, there aren't any. So the Toyota Mirai is pretty much the only example. And there's the issue of investment in the infrastructure. So at the moment, there's such a quantum investment needed in building out the electrical charging and in developing electrical vehicles within all the car companies that we found it very hard to see where a second stream of capital would come from to push hydrogen fuel cells in cars and the associated infrastructure needed. And that and the benefit once you've done it is not so obvious. There is a benefit in the 2030s if you manage it, compared to goods vehicles and buses where the quantum of benefit is greater and the ability to bring all those vehicles to one point to charge them or to fuel them is a lot greater. So I think that I can strongly see and I can understand in the maths the need for them in the heavy goods vehicles and perhaps buses, but the maths and economics for passenger cars, I'm not convinced yet.